short reflection on the Dhamma. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Dutiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. So nice to see everybody here today. And this week is a special week. So this, I think it's Saturday, is the full moon in May. And that marks Vesak Puja. Vesak Puja, I think pretty much almost everybody here knows about Vesak. Kind of in Theravada countries all over the world, Theravada and Buddhist countries, temples all over the world. This Saturday, depending how they calculate the months, some might be Sunday, some might be Friday. But this is when the Buddha's birth, enlightenment, and parinibbāna are commemorated. So in the Theravada tradition, all these three events are said to have taken place on the same lunar day, kind of the first full moon in May. And so the Mahayana, they have a little different systems. I think it's his birth is in the winter, and his enlightenment is a different day. But this is where it's celebrated in Theravada. And so every Vesak, I don't know if it's a tradition, but we always maybe feels good to talk about the life of the Buddha. It's often, in the especially meditation class, we try to give practical advice on meditation teachings, advice on training the mind. But all these things, at least in the Theravada tradition, have their source, have their origin in the Buddha. And so it's not something you can really forget about. It's why one of the reasons why when we start the meditation, we always start with this kind of a homage to the Buddha. It's because the meditation teachings that we have, the methods of training the mind that we have, they come from him. So he was said to be a very special person because, as I said, these things come from him. It wasn't like a group of people that it came from. It wasn't like, modern day science, where many scientists put their heads together and through peer review discover new things. All of this was from one person, kind of a Buddha. So this is the function of a Buddha. It's kind of they're the person who develops all these skills and then passes them down. So we don't have to go through the same difficulties they did in becoming a Buddha. And there's many Buddhas. It kind of doesn't really say the number in the text. Some commentaries give a list back to like 36 or maybe more than 100, some of them. And in the canon itself, it gives a list back to seven Buddhas. So our Buddha, when you hear him speak, it's very humbling because they talk about all the other Buddhas. The seventh previous Buddha, the lifespan in his time, some of these times are just almost unimaginable. He was actually 91 eons ago, I think. It's 91 times ago that the universe devolved and revolved. That was when this Buddha was born. His name was Vipassana. And in his time, the lifespan was huge. I think it was like 80,000 years. And he had like 3 assemblies of disciples. And I think some of them were more than 1 million people. And kind of all became arahants. And then as you went down these various lists of Buddhas, the lifespan keeps getting shorter and shorter. And then in our eon, this time when we have our universe now, it's said to be a fortunate eon. Because I think there's 3 or 4 Buddhas that have arisen in this eon. Ours is the most recent, and there's one more to come. And that's going to be the last one. And our Buddha, the lifespan is the shortest. And although Buddhas are the supreme, our Buddha comes across very humble. His lifespan in his time, the lifespan is the shortest. he comes across as having the smallest number of disciples, kind of 1,250 arahants, one assembly of them in his time. And he was born at this time, kind of our time right now. And the following Buddha, there's supposed to be a big war that kills most people on earth at some point. And then the survivors of that war hide out in the forest. Those are the people who live. They're not in big areas. They're the people in rural areas, people in not that populated areas. And they start thinking to themselves, oh, you know, it wasn't good that we became so unvirtuous. We had this huge war, so let's be virtuous. So they start becoming virtuous, and over time, they gain greater and greater lifespans until their lifespan reaches a long period. I can't remember how long it's supposed to be. And then cities, the human population rises until it said cities are so close together that a crow or a hen or something could fly between them. They don't fly very far. And that's when the next Buddha is said to arise. His name is Metteyya. But in any event, we're here training under this Buddha, our Buddha, the Buddha Gautama, and it's actually best not to meet the Buddha Metteyya because it means that you'll still be in saṁsara. So it's much better to exit saṁsara under the teachings of our Buddha, the Buddha Gautama. And so our Buddha was born in India about more than 2,500 years ago, like 25, I think it's like 2,568 or something like that years ago. And he was born in an aristocratic family. And kind of the tradition is that he was born to a king. But in the text, what we find is that he never refers to himself as a king. Never refers to his father as a king. And there's actually, in the text, there's a leader of the Sakyans who is referred to as kind of like their leader, who becomes a monk. And so he was basically born to a very rich, wealthy man. What his status was in this town, we don't know. But he was born to a very rich man. And he was born in these gardens by his mother on his way. She was traveling, I think, to her maternal parents to give birth, which I think was the custom. And she died 7 days after giving birth to him. She gave birth to him in a garden. And after he was born, his father supplied him with all the delights you could imagine. So it said that he had 3 palaces, kind of 3 big houses at least, one for the winter, one for the rains, and one for the spring. These kind of 3 seasons in ancient India. And he was basically entertained all the time. And this shows you how wealthy our time is, because the sign of wealth in his time was that his servants in his house ate like whole rice, which I think was probably like peeled rice, like white rice, and meat. And in other people's houses, they ate like broken rice and maybe lentils or something like that. So now everybody can eat meat, whether you can eat a big chicken, never mind a curry, whether you're a servant or not. So we're much wealthier then. But this was a huge sign of wealth at his time. So his father was very wealthy. And he grew up in this kind of luxury, kind of said to be the extremes of luxury. Actually, there's some parts of his luxury that I probably won't repeat, but back then they had different, they were up to some more things than people these days. So he lived in a lot of luxury. And he was quite favored by his parents. I think it was their only, might have been, no, he had a half-brother. But by that wife, he was the only son. She died after that. But anyways, he decided that he wanted to become a samana. The texts say that first he saw, the legends say first he saw a sick man, then an old man, and a dead man, and a monk. And it was after seeing the monk he decided to become samana. But in the actual suttas, it basically says that he just left and his parents were crying. So it sounds like they may have known about his decision, not wanted him to do it. But in any event, he left and became a monk. After becoming a monk, he started to wander. So at this time in ancient India, they had a kind of different culture than we do now. Kind of in the same way our culture is focused on technological advancement. All the interest in Western culture is geared towards the next new technology. Back then, the interest in Indian culture was geared towards spiritual advancement. I just kind of remember first reading this, and it was hard to wrap my mind around what it would be like, because it was so different than our culture. Yeah? And in the same way, the kind of top, most big celebrities in our culture are these people really know about scientists, sports heroes, all these things. Okay, then they might have known about generals. But the entertainment of the day was the kind of philosophical debates of these samanas, these people who had left the home life to try to find this kind of spiritual goal they were looking for. So these people called samanas, they're this different class of people. So actually monks were called samanas. That's what we are called. And it comes from this whole class. Like back then, a samana wasn't just a Buddhist monk. At that time in India, you had this they had this caste systems, kind of broken up into 4 main castes, kind of the Brahmins. The Khattiyas were on top at that time. Later it became the Brahmins. So it was the Khattiyas, the Brahmins, it was the Vaishyas, and the Sudras, kind of the 4 main ones. And the Brahmins at that time, they were starting to get a little bit, desirous of power. So in the Buddhist text, it talks about how Brahmins formerly were these very virtuous people, kind of like these priests. And they kept these very strict practices, kind of just totally devoted their whole life to religion in intense ways. They were celibate for the first 48 years of their life. Then they sought their teacher's fee through alms. Then they paid their teacher, their guru. And then if they wanted to, they would have a child. But after that, they would leave their wife. And they wouldn't settle down. They would go back to the forest. And then some would settle down. But originally, it was this was the ideal. You go back to the forest. But eventually, these Brahmins, at least in the Buddhist text, started to get corrupt and started to want more power. So what they started to do was tell people that they had to perform these rituals in order to gain what they needed to go to heaven. And these rituals basically involve killing animals. So these days, Hinduism is known for its nonviolence. But actually, this nonviolence was adopted in competition with the Buddhists and the Jains. Originally, Brahmanism was, the original Brahmins in the Buddhist text were quite holy people. But in the time of the Buddha, they degenerated to become this kind of sacrificial cult that demanded money in exchange for performing rituals that would get people into heaven. And so there was a number of people who got kind of tired of this. Okay, Brahmins want money, And then they started to say they were the highest caste and everybody else was no good. And so this group of people called samanas basically just left the whole society and said, I don't need this, I can do this on my own. And so they basically started to try to find an alternative definition of kamma. So kamma in the Brahmin sense was performing these rituals to get points to get you into heaven. But then this idea started to creep in that kamma wasn't about performing rituals, that it came from actions. So these were the kind of new ideas that started to come up in this time. So actually, originally when you read the Vedas, read some of the Vedas, it doesn't seem like reincarnation was a big thing. Like in the oldest Vedas, like the Rig Veda, it's more like, they burn up the body in this way so that they go to the lands of their forefathers, forever type thing. Kind of this is the type of deal. But this time was a time of intellectual ferment, the time of the Buddha. So this is when these new ideas about kamma, ideas about the nature of rebirth started to arise. And when we see all the different ways that rebirth was formulated in the Buddhist time, it was different. Different schools had different ideas, different thoughts about the way that rebirth was coming about. So not only did you have this kind of philosophical debate going on philosophical interest, you also had this competition. So you had all these different schools of these people who left their life, who were centered around these really charismatic leaders. And these leaders competed for prestige. And often they were so popular, kings would go to watch them. So this tells you how popular it is. And now you might have the president going to like a Knicks game or whatever. Back then, the king would go to listen to the debates of these philosophers. And so similar to our business world right now, our science and technology world now, you had a strong interest and you had free competition, less regulated competition between people competing for an ideal. And so in the same way that these elements give rise to technological breakthroughs in our culture, they gave rise to spiritual breakthroughs in the Buddhist time, gave rise to an interest in this. So the Buddha, before his next to last life, was said to live in the two-seat of heaven. And Buddhas only come when it's the right time. As you imagine, even if a person with the skills of the Buddha was born in, the Amazon jungle, then it wouldn't be a good time for his teaching. So he was born at this time of intellectual ferment, this time of philosophical interest, this time when people were trying to find an answer to this problem, which is that karma started to be seen as something cyclic. In other words, you weren't just going to go to the lands of your fathers forever. You keep getting born again and again and again and again and again and again. Seen as something terrible. It's kind of saṁsara. So the Buddha was born into this time, and he set out to try to find an answer to this question. How do we end suffering? So in his early wanderings, he first wandered in Rajagaha, and said that the king there saw him being so noble, and he came up to him and said, I'll give you a whole army, join my court. And the Buddha said, no, I'm going off to, practice. Now, following this, he went and found two different teachers. The first one taught this state, which they call the base of nothingness, which actually the Buddha later taught himself. This is the kind of meditation that comes after the jhanas. And so at first he went to this teacher, his name was Alara Kalama, and he stayed with him for a while. And he was reciting, like they had this kind of recitation. Like if you just learn the suttas, our Buddha suttas, and just, recite them. And then he thought to himself, wait a minute, it's not just through reciting that Alara Kalama knows about the base of nothingness. He knows about it through actually practicing it. And then he thought to himself, wait a minute, it's not just Alara Kalama who has faith, who has virtue, who has concentration, who has energy. I've got those things too. Suppose I were to directly know this base of nothingness. So then he said it wasn't long until he dwelled in the base of nothingness. And then Alara Kalama, he described it to him. Alara Kalama said, come, we'll lead this school together. But the Buddha thought to himself, this doesn't lead to the ending of suffering. So he left. And he went and found another teacher who taught a higher level of meditation, which is called the base of neither perception nor non-perception. And this teacher actually couldn't do it himself. Only his father could. And his father passed it along to him, and he couldn't do it, but his father could. So his father was named Rama, and his name was Uddaka Ramaputta. And so the Buddha went to him. Almost the same story repeats itself, except he thinks, it wasn't just Rama who has these qualities, I've got them too. Suppose I were to dwell in the base of neither perception nor non-perception, which again he later incorporated into his meditation teaching. So he did. And then Uddaka said, just like Rama was, so are you. Just like you are, so is Rama. Come, lead this school. So he's going to give him the whole school. But the Buddha thought to himself, this doesn't lead to Nibbāna either. So he left that teacher too. So at this time in ancient India, not only did you have people trying to achieve the ending of samsara through meditation, you also had people trying to achieve the ending of samsara through suffering. So this is where you get these extremes of what they call ascetic practices. So you had people who would break a limb and let it grow at an odd angle. You had people who would stand on one foot until vines started to grow around them, who would hold their arm out until their arm started to deteriorate. And you had people who would fast. Fasting was big for all these different amounts of time, who would refuse food in all these various ways. And so the Buddha thought, well, look, I haven't attained Nibbāna in this way. I didn't find it so through pleasure, so maybe I'll find it through pain. And so basically, he had this simile beforehand about this wet and sappy wood. It's like if wood is wet and sappy, and you take a fire stick and try to light the fire, it won't light. But if the wood is not wet, not sappy, you take a fire stick, try to light it, it lights. So in other words, he had this idea that if you have any pleasure at all, then you're not going to achieve liberation. So he set out, well, this was his test anyway, so he set out to deny himself, basically, almost seems like all forms of pleasure. And through this asceticism, he just stopped eating food so much that his limbs started to waste away. And at the end of his asceticism, towards the end, it said that his limbs became like a kind of knotted vine. So it's kind of very thin, and then they've got these bumps on them, these vines. He said his hair was so, he was so in such poor health that he would rub his hair, and his hair was rotted at the roots, so it would fall out. And he said the gleam of his eyes had sunk, between his brows like wells. You look down into a well and you just see a little bit of light from the water. And he said that if he touched his stomach, he would touch his spine. He was so thin. And if he went to urinate or defecate, he would fall over because he couldn't, he was just so weak from his asceticism. So this is where you see these statues where they're basically emaciated. And so after this, he thought this isn't the right way to achieve Nibbāna. So he left. He had these 5 monks attending on him. And they got disgusted with him. He took solid food and he left. And he remembered when he was young that he had this experience of jhana. And these jhanas, one of the interesting things, you think, okay, wait a minute, he learned these higher jhanas from his teacher. So why did he remember this jhana? But apparently there's ways to get to these formless states without going through the 4 jhanas. So you remember this experience of jhana where he had this pleasure that wasn't of the body, that wasn't based on sensuality, and was a kind of blameless type of pleasure. So he thought, well, maybe this is the way. Maybe this is the way to the ending of suffering. And he thought, this is the way. So then he sat down to meditate after taking this meal, and he made this vow, I won't get up until I attain Nibbāna. So in other words, he would die there, or attain Nibbāna before rising from his seat. And so in the first watch of the night, he remembered his past lives. In the second watch of the night, he gained insight into the arising away and passing of beings according to their kamma. And in the third watch of the night, he attained the ending of the taints, ending of suffering. This is called the Buddha's enlightenment. It's what we call it now, his enlightenment. And this was attained under what they call a Bodhi tree. This is why you see all these various Bodhi trees. And following this for the next 45 years of the Buddha's life, or 40 years of the Buddha's life, he traveled India, wandering and preaching to basically all various types of people, kings, taught to lepers, basically anybody who wanted to learn. And towards the ending of his life, he went and ate some pork from a smith. And we don't know what was up with the pork, but he said nobody else eat the pork. And then he ate it and let it be. And a couple days later, he died of food poisoning between 2 trees called the sal trees. Before his death, he refused to appoint a successor. He had 2 chief disciples, Sariputta and Moggallana, but he said, when I die, don't think you don't have a leader. The Dhamma and discipline that I laid down for you will be your leader after I pass away. So to this day, that's the leader of the Sangha. And to this day, Buddhists around the world still draw inspiration from his life. The Buddha was said to be a Dhammakaya. In other words, a Dhamma body. So this concept got taken and enlarged a lot in later schools of Buddhism. What it basically means is that in all of his actions, he was a teacher. In all of his actions, he was teaching. And the great thing about the Buddhist path is that it's not a path of extremes. It's what he called the Majjhima Patipada. So after he attained enlightenment, he went back to teach his group of 5 friends. And they were like, how could you attain enlightenment? You've gone back to luxury. You should read when you read the sutta, it's kind of funny. Because he's like, have you ever heard me talk about this before? And they're like, how could you, attain enlightenment, Gautama, when you've reverted to luxury, But in his first sermon to them, after he convinced them, this is what he described, was that this is a middle path of practice. The path of practice that avoids the extremes of sensuality that he experienced when he was young, and avoids the extremes of asceticism that he experienced when he's older. And this one principle, in and of itself, is what makes the Buddha's path of practice a skill. It's what makes it something that takes whatever elements there are that are skillful and applies them to use whatever techniques are skillful to find a way to end the suffering that's present in our minds. And both the Buddha's quest, both his experiences as a prince, his experiences as an ascetic, although they come from a totally different culture, they're still relevant today. Their message is still relevant today. So I remember reading about his life as a prince and seeing, oh, this is almost the same as the modern West. You have all this stuff, and yet people are not satisfied. They're not happy. And similarly, you kind of deny yourself all this stuff, become a total pauper, like you read about some early other religious traditions, just beat yourself up, feel guilty and terrible. This is also not the way to end suffering. Yeah? The way to end suffering is through this development of a skill. And so this is one of the things, that the Buddha was a teacher for his disciples and not a god. He wasn't a commander. He was like somebody who stood at a crossroads and said, this is the way to Rajagaha, this is the way to follow, and whether people follow it or not is up to them. So one of the reasons for this is because the Buddha's insight on Kamma, his teaching on it, was that it's based on our intentions. Whatever good and bad things happen to us in our life, our experience of the world is based on our intentions, the actions we take, the actions by body, the actions by speech, and the actions by mind. And the liberating thing about his description of the Kamma is that it doesn't rely on Brahmas to do it. You don't need a religious specialist. We do it ourselves. But because of this, it also has a responsibility. It means that the Buddha can't liberate us. It's not like a savior figure. It's more like a teacher. We ourselves, it's possible for us to make our world what we wish, to achieve ends of sufferings we may not have thought we could. But it's possible, and it's also a responsibility. It's something the Buddha never said he would do for us. He just pointed the way. And so for this reason, one of these reasons, he left the teachings as his leader, because as the leader of the sasana. And these teachings are still here with us today. And we still have the suttas. We still have the Vinaya. And he created a body of practitioners, a body of professionals in his teachings that these were to be passed down to. And we have this kind of monastic sangha. So if you become a monk, you join a monastic sangha, you have a lineage that stretches back to the Buddha. You have these kind of teachings that stretch back to the Buddha. Because although our times have changed, quite a lot, although we now drive in cars, fly in airplanes, talk on cell phones, do things that required psychic powers in the Buddha's time, everybody does them now. The Buddha's message about what suffering is, the Buddha's teachings on its cause, the Buddha's teachings on its cessation, and the Buddha's teachings on the path to its cessation are things that are still as relevant today. Although we have all these things, although we're different, still we suffer. Although we have all these things, although it's a different age, still we crave. Although we have all these things, it's a different age. If we end craving, we end suffering. And although we have all these things, it's a different age. If we practice, that's where we see for ourselves. That's when we see for ourselves the ending of the Buddha's path. And so the amazing thing about Buddhas is that they arise for the sake of teaching this way to the ending of suffering. But at a certain point in a Buddha's quest, they have to realize for themselves that what they're going to teach, the goal that they're going to teach, will make all their students equal to them in terms of their liberation. So at that point, Buddhas only go on compassion. Because for people who achieve the ending of suffering, their ending of suffering and the Buddha's ending of suffering is no different. No difference between the cessation of suffering in the mind of somebody who becomes an arahant today and the Buddha at the night of his enlightenment. So it's because the Buddha had this compassion, it's because the Buddha had this determination that he went through life after life, time after time, in order to discover this himself, in order to teach it to people, in order to benefit people. So that, even today, 2,500 years after his passing, we have this opportunity. We have this opportunity recorded in the suttas, passed down through the monastic sangha, and embodied in the people who even today still achieve its results. So this is something that the Buddha gave as a gift, and a gift that we can know ourselves. And this is the highest gift it's possible to give. The highest thing it's possible to achieve is the ending of suffering, the ending of dukkha. So much gratitude to our teacher, the Lord Buddha, for all of his efforts, for teaching, and for coming to this world 2,500 years ago and giving this opportunity. Good to remember him on Vesak.